The social turn began to take hold, and a number of people were sort of helping us sort of, I think, build the bridges towards it. As I've said, the Bryan Street and James Gee were sort of arguing that, wow, we really need to look at literacy as a social practice and get rid of this sort of mechanical, autonomous text view solely within the head. A person whose work was quite influential at this time was Barton and Hamilton, who actually outlined literacy as social practice and what the features were of that, and clearly sort of began to move us to a sort of almost a Shirley Bryce Heath orientation to the literacy events and the literacy practices. Victoria Purcell Gates, whose work I shared with you in Appalachia, also began to make this move. And in conjunction with a centre she established at UBC, a Cultural Practices of Literacy Centre, began to encourage colleagues to do detailed studies of literacies in communities. Indeed, if you go to the website for the centre, you'll find a number of these studies which they delve into literacy practices and acts within different communities. And in conjunction with that, and the sort of befitting the centre itself and its sort of role of auditing communities in a sense and creating a depository whereby people could actually look at this data, they suggested a model. And the model had at its centre the agency of the individual dealing with the text genre and the functions of the text. And these aspects were what has been historically observed. But then suggesting, well, you need to look at it much more largely in terms of what's the social purpose of this that's going on, what are the social actions involved, what are the values, the beliefs and history that are involved in this. And then also identifying on the outer perimeters, what's the power? What are the power dynamics? What are the institutional forces at play? And very much moving us, in one sense, I think, beginning to move beyond just the social turn to a critical turn. And very much influenced by sort of a combination of influences, some which we're all aware of, sort of Marxist interest in capital and capital flows, but also influenced by the important Frankfurt School, which sort of migrated to the US at the beginning of World War II. But the Institute of Social Sciences there was very much into interrogating positivism and the power that positivism has had on our construction of the world, arguing against a hegemonic orientation to knowledge, to a view of knowledge, much more critiquing and building upon an interrogation of issues of power at the institutional level. And perhaps the most influential one, at least in terms of Paulo Freire and his concept of liberation pedagogy, encouraging people to interrogate what's going on in the name of education, in particular literacy education, to sort of examine the institutions and the interplay and demythologize some of the what was occurring, in a sense to move beyond, to really examine the oppression that may be at play as one sort of looks at the power of the institutions and how this sort of plays out for Paulo Freire, who was working in Brazil predominantly, at the level of community and villages, but particularly in schools in the name of literacy. And his work was particularly influential in the West through Paulo's translation of his work, his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and some of the work of some of his colleagues became quite influential. Indeed, if you look at today, at the University of Victoria, the UN chair there, Bud Hall, was a colleague of Paulo Freire, and very much he has been influenced by Paulo Freirean concepts in terms of education, and still focuses upon that liberation pedagogy. Some of you are aware that at UBC we recently had a conference which was sort of an anniversary of Paulo Freire visiting UBC. At UCLA, one of his colleagues from Argentina, Carlos Torres, is the UN chair there, and as the UN chair has created a sort of a centre which is very much tied to Paulo Freirean ideas. Which again is sort of focused on sort of looking, building upon the social cultural perspectives to challenging what they characterize as the oppressive tendencies. Now, Freirean work had an influence in terms of scholarly writings in this area, but also had a huge influence on various projects. To an extent, the famous Nicaraguan Literacy Project focused on making people not observers of their life, but participants in it, was very much driven by a Freirean sort of philosophical orientation. Auguste Boal's work on the theatre of the oppressed, which is basically using theatre as an opportunity for people to examine and scrutinize and role-play in conjunction with their local problem solving, is very much, again, tied to a Freirean model. And on an annual basis is those Auguste Boal's workshops are carried out in the US by, originally by Boal, but now by his son. So Freire's influence in all of this was pretty major. From a US perspective and a Canadian perspective, and I'd say Australian, and I'm not sure to what extent it extends to Asia. The problem with Freirean work, which was identified, was its failure to differentiate. And for African Americans, for example, and feminists, felt, for example, that Freirean's work was being applied in a too almost sort of generic fashion, and push back against Freirean ideas with an argument for the need to actually develop critical thinking or what they critical literacy philosophy and tenets, much more tied to the analyses of feminist issues, and in particular the variety of feminist perspectives that were emerging as feminist theory grew, particularly post-structural feminists, but also extending into postmodernist feminist ideas and so on. And likewise, also critical race theory.